I was working as a bartender in downtown Seattle, pulling late-night shifts to make ends meet. Life as a bartender can be exhausting, the hours are long, and the people can be unpredictable. But it suited me. The hustle of the city felt alive at night, and I liked the quiet that came after closing time. The real problem, though, was the walk home. I lived about a mile from the bar, and the quickest route involved passing through an underpass on I-5. It wasn't the safest part of town, but I wasn't exactly making enough money to afford anything better. Seattle, despite its reputation for grunge music and coffee shops, had an underbelly. Homelessness was an issue that couldn't be ignored. You'd see people on every corner, many of them addicts, some mentally ill, and all just trying to survive. I knew that. But knowing it didn't make me feel any safer on those long walks home. After closing up the bar, it'd be well past 2 a.m., and the streets would be mostly empty. The walk to my apartment was usually quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. The underpass, though, was different. It was darker there, the street lights casting long shadows, and I always saw a few homeless people sleeping along the sides. It wasn't uncommon to hear strange sounds, rustling or murmuring as I passed. I'd learned to keep my head down, mind my own business, and walk fast. That was just how it was. One night, after another long shift, I was walking home as usual. As I approached the underpass, I noticed something different. There was a man standing near one of the pillars, partially hidden in the shadows. He wasn't lying down like the others, he was just watching. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stared at me as I passed by. His figure was hard to make out in the dim light, but I could feel his eyes on me. I quickened my pace, not wanting to make eye contact, and before I knew it, I was out of the underpass and into the safety of the open street. I told myself it was nothing. Seattle had its share of strange people, and he was probably just another homeless guy trying to keep warm under the freeway. But still, something about the way he stood there, motionless, watching me, gave me an uneasy feeling. The next night, I had another closing shift, and I found myself dreading the walk home. I shook off the feeling. It was probably just my imagination getting the better of me. But as I approached the underpass again, my stomach tightened. There he was. The same man, standing in the exact same spot, only this time, as I got closer, he took a step toward me. My heart raced, but I kept walking. I didn't want to run, didn't want to show him I was scared, but I couldn't help the knot of fear tightening in my chest. When I made it out of the underpass, I glanced back over my shoulder. He hadn't followed me, but he was still there, standing in the shadows. For the next few weeks, every time I passed through the underpass, the same man was there. Every night, he stood in the same place, watching me, never saying a word. But what really unnerved me was that each night, he seemed to get a little closer. One night, he was only a few feet away as I walked by. I could hear him breathing, heavy and slow. I didn't know what his deal was, but it was starting to feel like he was targeting me. I considered taking a different route, but the other way would add an extra 20 minutes to my walk, and after a long shift, that was the last thing I wanted. Besides, I told myself, he hadn't actually done anything to me. Not yet, anyway. But the thought lingered in the back of my mind, what if one night he decided to act? One particularly cold night in November, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread as I walked home. The bar had been busy, and I was more exhausted than usual, but my nerves were on edge. As I neared the underpass, my heart started pounding. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. He was there, closer than ever before, standing just a few feet from the sidewalk. This time, he moved more deliberately. As I approached, he stepped out of the shadows, blocking my path. I froze for a split second before instinct kicked in, and I swerved around him, practically jogging to get past. I could feel his eyes burning into the back of my neck, but I didn't dare turn around. I just kept moving, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty street. I didn't sleep well that night. The image of the man standing so close, almost within reach, played over and over in my head. I didn't know what to do. He hadn't spoken, hadn't touched me, but I felt like a mouse being watched by a cat, waiting for the moment it decided to pounce. The next night, I made the decision to avoid the underpass altogether. I took the longer route, staying on well-lit streets with more foot traffic. It added an extra 20 minutes to my walk, but the relief I felt was worth it. For the next few weeks, I stuck to the new route, even though it was inconvenient. The fear that the man might follow me was too strong to ignore. A few months later, I was scrolling through the news on my phone when a headline caught my eye. Homeless man arrested for attack near I-5 underpass. My stomach dropped. I clicked on the article, and as I read, the details sent a chill down my spine. A homeless man had been arrested for attacking a woman in the exact same underpass where I used to walk. The description of the man, tall, scruffy, with a weathered face, matched the figure who had watched me night after night. I felt a cold wave of nausea wash over me. That could have been me. For weeks, I had passed him by, barely avoiding his gaze, while he inched closer and closer. The thought that I had been so close to danger without fully realizing it haunted me. I couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if I hadn't changed my route when I did. After that, I couldn't bring myself to walk that way again. I moved out of that apartment a few months later, found a new job, and put some distance between myself and the underpass. But every now and then, when I walk through a dimly lit area late at night, I feel that same creeping sense of dread. I glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the shadow of a figure standing in the distance, watching, waiting. Some nights, I still dream about the man under the underpass. In my dreams, he's always just a few steps behind, silent and relentless, never saying a word but always there. And every time I wake up, I can't help but wonder how close I really came to becoming his next victim. I work the night shift at a rehabilitation center called Haven Ridge. Our facility is secured with a tall fence, and there's a surveillance camera mounted high above the gate, along with a doorbell camera to keep an eye on the entrance. In the office, I have a monitor displaying the security feed on one wall and the doorbell camera on another. The monitors are my constant companions during the long, quiet hours, offering a glimpse into the world outside the sanctuary of Haven Ridge, a world that often felt a million miles away from the fragile hope that resided within these walls. Most nights, the monitors are a tableau of tranquil darkness, punctuated by the occasional car headlights gliding past or the rustling of leaves in the wind. But on this particular night, something shifted. It started subtly, a faint movement in the periphery of my vision as I was hunched over paperwork, the glow of the computer screen reflecting in my tired eyes. A figure, a man, strolled past the gate. He was shrouded in the dim light of the street lamp, a silhouette against the stark backdrop of the fence. His movements were deliberate, slow, almost like he was in a trance. He stopped for a moment, paused, and then slowly turned around. And that's when it happened. He started staring directly up at the camera. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a casual glance, a quick check of his surroundings. No, this was a fixed gaze, intense and unsettling. His face, obscured by shadows, wasn't particularly menacing, but there was something about his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. They seemed hollow, devoid of life, like dark pools reflecting a void. His expression was unnervingly vacant, as if he were lost in a world of dark thoughts, far removed from the reality of the moment. My initial thought was that he might be under the influence of something, a synthetic substance, perhaps. It wasn't uncommon in this part of the city. I reached for the intercom, my hand trembling slightly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice a little weaker than I intended. "Is everything all right?" There was no response. No movement. He just kept staring at the camera, that unnerving gaze unwavering. The silence stretched, amplifying the unease that was creeping into my chest. At Haven Ridge, we have a strict rule: if someone isn't hurt or attempting to breach the fence, it's best to leave them be. Engaging could provoke a potentially dangerous situation, especially considering the area we're in. We dealt with a lot of troubled souls here, people grappling with addiction, trauma, and mental health issues. The last thing we needed was an escalation, a confrontation. And so, I did nothing. I watched, a captive audience to this strange performance unfolding on my monitor. For 2 agonizing hours he stood there, unblinking, his eerie stare fixed on me through the lens of the camera. The longer he remained, the more unsettling it became. Was he aware that I could see him? Was he deliberately trying to communicate something, or was he simply lost in his own disturbed world? I did my rounds, a nervous energy buzzing beneath my skin. Every few minutes, I'd glance back at the monitor, my heart pounding in my chest. The sight of him never grew less unsettling. It felt like he was looking right through the camera, right into my soul. I imagined his hollow eyes piercing through the screen, judging me, assessing me. When I returned to the office, he was gone. Vanished. The absence of his intense gaze only amplified my unease. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted, but in its place, a chilling emptiness settled in my mind. What had he been thinking? What had he wanted? Was he lost and desperate, seeking help or solace, or was it something far more sinister? I couldn't shake the feeling that he was a ghost, a specter of the darkness that lurked just beyond the borders of Haven Ridge. That night haunted me. It chipped away at the facade of normalcy I tried to maintain in this place of healing and hope. The silence of the facility, usually calming, now felt ominous. The rustle of leaves outside my window sounded like whispers, and shadows danced with a sinister life of their own. The incident became a recurring thought, a stark reminder of how unpredictable life can be, especially when you're alone in a place filled with both hope and despair. It made me question the nature of the darkness that resided in the human heart, the darkness that could manifest even in the most unexpected places. In the days that followed, I found myself constantly checking the security feed, searching for any sign of the man, any clue to his identity or purpose. But he never returned. He remained a mystery, a fleeting shadow in the night, a haunting reminder of the fragility of order and the unsettling depths of the human psyche. Haven Ridge, with its tall fence and promise of healing, had always felt like a sanctuary. But that night, the illusion of safety had been shattered. The world outside our walls, with its hidden anxieties and unsettling presences, had seeped in, a chilling reminder that even in a place dedicated to hope, the darkness could always find a way to linger. And I, the solitary night watchman, was left to grapple with the unsettling questions and the lingering unease, a silent witness to a night that wouldn't fade from my memory. For a few years, I worked at a convenience store in downtown Crescent City, a small, brightly lit space nestled between a pawn shop and a dingy laundromat. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead mingled with the distant wail of sirens, creating a soundtrack of urban decay. Our store was a constant hub of activity, selling snacks, lottery tickets, and cheap coffee to a rotating cast of locals, tourists, and the occasional night owl. But then there was Frank. Every evening, like clockwork, he would appear outside our storefront. An older man, probably in his late 50s, with a scraggly beard that seemed to absorb the grime of the streets, and eyes that held the weight of unspoken sorrows. He'd stand awkwardly near the entrance, his clothes stained and threadbare, a weathered cardboard sign clutched in his hand. "Spare change," it read in faded marker, a desperate plea that hung in the air like a bad smell. 9 times out of 10, if anyone refused, he'd respond in a way that chilled me to the bone. He would expose himself, his wrinkled, disheveled body a sight that no one should have to endure, a grotesque display of vulnerability and desperation that twisted my stomach. I found myself chasing him away each night, my heart hammering in my chest as I yelled, "Get out of here!" I didn't want the customers, many just trying to grab a quick soda or a pack of cigarettes, to experience that trauma. It was a sight that, once seen, could never be forgotten, a horror etched into their memories like a brand. But my efforts were often met with misunderstanding. Passers-by, seeing me shooing Frank away, would give me dirty looks, their expressions twisted in judgment. Some would mutter under their breath, labeling me as heartless, assuming I harbored deep-seated hatred for the homeless. They couldn't comprehend the urgency behind my actions, the swirling anxiety that came from wanting to protect them from a horror that threatened to consume us all. What frustrated me even more was the growing sense of helplessness. I was just a convenience store clerk, a teenager thrust into a world filled with complexities far beyond my understanding. I was caught in a web of conflicting emotions, empathy for Frank, whose demons drove him to such desperate acts, and a profound sense of responsibility toward my customers, who deserved to feel safe and respected. As I continued my shifts, the weight of my actions began to take its toll. Each encounter with Frank blurred the lines between reality and the nightmares creeping into my mind. The familiar streets of Crescent City began to morph into a landscape of dread. I started to see him lurking in shadows, his grotesque grin haunting my thoughts, even during my days off. The once vibrant city now felt like a twisted reflection of my fears, every alley a potential hiding place for the nightmare I tried so hard to outrun. The normalcy of life shattered, leaving behind jagged remnants. My sleep became erratic, plagued by vivid dreams where Frank's distorted figure loomed large, a constant reminder of the grotesque acts I had witnessed. I lost my appetite, my once vibrant personality fading into a muted shell of anxiety, and I became trapped in a cycle of dread, constantly anticipating the next encounter, the next grotesque display that would shatter whatever fragile sense of safety I had left. Fear seeped into every aspect of my existence. The once familiar sounds of the city, the distant siren, the rumble of passing cars, the murmur of late-night conversations, now felt ominous, like harbingers of something terrible waiting to unfold. I grew increasingly withdrawn, isolating myself from friends and family. The city that once promised freedom now felt like a suffocating cage. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was slowly succumbing to the darkness that clung to Frank's presence. I wondered how long it would be before I, too, became trapped in that never-ending horror. Would I start seeing him in every corner, in every shadow? Would his grotesque grin become etched into the very fabric of my reality? The line between protector and victim blurred. I was the one shielding others from a nightmare, yet I was the one being consumed by it. I longed for a solution that didn't involve simply chasing Frank away, a solution that addressed the root of his pain, the darkness manifesting in such a disturbing way. Yet the resources for such interventions felt scarce, and the systems designed to help those in need seemed to fail miserably at addressing the complexities of mental illness and social decay. I was left with the heavy weight of responsibility, a burden threatening to crush me. I was a teenager, trapped in a grown-up's world, struggling to reconcile the horrors I witnessed with the need to protect those around me, and myself. My experience with Frank served as a stark reminder of the human condition's complexity and pain. It was a harsh lesson in the unpredictable nature of life, the fragility of the mind, and the challenges that arise when navigating human suffering. The greatest horrors often reside within ourselves, hidden behind the masks we wear. And as I continued to navigate the seemingly endless nights, chasing away the shadows of a man who embodied society's darkest parts, I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever truly escape the chilling grip of that never-ending horror. I had a routine. Every evening, I'd take my dog, Max, for a long walk through the local park. It was one of those sprawling parks, with thick woods at one end and an open field at the other, dotted with picnic tables and playground equipment. Max loved to sniff around, chasing after squirrels and sometimes getting distracted by the occasional passerby. However, there was one part of the park I avoided. Deep in the woods, just beyond a cluster of tall pines, a small camp had formed. It had been there for months, with a few makeshift tents and the remnants of campfires. I'd seen it often, and though I felt a twinge of sympathy for the people living there, I kept my distance. After all, I didn't want to intrude. But there was one man who caught my attention. He was tall and thin, with unkempt hair and a scruffy beard. I'd only seen him a couple of times, always sitting quietly outside his tent, staring off into the trees. He never looked at anyone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was more a part of the shadows than the camp itself. The other campers seemed to avoid him, and I quickly learned to do the same. One chilly October evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I noticed a strong, rancid smell wafting through the air. Max was sniffing around, his ears perked up, and I followed his lead, curious yet wary. The odor was unsettling, a mix of decay and something else that I couldn't quite place. I glanced in the direction of the camp, but the trees obscured my view. "Come on, Max," I urged, steering him away from the source of the smell. Yet, the next day, the stench was even worse. It hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating and oppressive. I felt a knot of dread forming in my stomach. Max, as if sensing my unease, kept close to my side. I hesitated, but my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my phone, just in case, and we headed towards the camp. As we approached, I noticed that the tall man's tent was eerily still. The door was unzipped, flapping slightly in the breeze. "Max, stay close," I whispered, more to reassure myself than him. I stepped closer, peering inside. The interior was dim, the light barely filtering through the fabric walls. There was a blanket strewn haphazardly, a couple of empty cans, and, what caught my breath, a dark stain on the ground. It was hard to see clearly, but it looked as though something had been spilled, and the smell was unbearable now, overpowering. I knocked softly on the side of the tent. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. There was no response. I pushed the tent flap a little more open, revealing the man sitting on the ground, his back against the tent wall. He looked as though he was sleeping, his long limbs sprawled out awkwardly. But something about the way he was slumped made my heart race. I stepped inside. "Sir?" My voice cracked. "Are you okay?" No answer. I knelt beside him, my heart pounding louder than ever. His face was pale, and I reached out, touching his shoulder gently. A chill coursed through me as I realized he was cold, unresponsive. Panic surged within me, and I fumbled for my phone, calling the police. "Hello? I need help. There's a man, he's not moving." The operator was calm, asking for my location. I barely heard them, my focus drawn back to the man. I noticed his eyes were half open, staring blankly at the tent's ceiling, and I fought the urge to recoil. "Is he alive?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The smell was overwhelming, and the sight of him left a heavy weight in my stomach. "He's dead, isn't he?" I murmured, looking around the tent as if something might give me a clue. I could see remnants of his life scattered about, photos, drawings, remnants of meals long gone. The police arrived within minutes, a pair of officers stepping into the tent, their expressions shifting from concern to grim realization. "You did the right thing by calling," one of them said. "We'll take care of it from here." They examined the scene, and my mind raced with questions. What had happened? Had he been here all alone? But something gnawed at me, a thought I couldn't shake. I remembered the way he had kept to himself, how no one ever approached him. Was he truly alone, or had someone been visiting him? After the officers completed their investigation, I lingered at the edge of the camp, watching as they packed up the man's belongings. They told me they'd notify family, but I couldn't help but wonder, did he even have family? Did anyone care? As the days turned into weeks, the smell eventually faded, but a lingering sense of dread remained. I continued my evening walks with Max, but the woods felt different now, like a wound that wouldn't heal. I often found myself glancing toward the spot where the man had camped, as if expecting to see him sitting there, gazing into the trees. But the camp slowly fell into disrepair. The other tents were abandoned, and eventually, the city came in to clear the area. I felt a mix of relief and guilt, knowing I would never know the man's story or what had truly happened in that secluded part of the park. One night, several weeks after the man's death, I decided to walk a different route, feeling too heavy to return to the usual path. I ventured deeper into the woods, where the trees grew thick and the underbrush was dense. Max seemed uneasy, tugging at his leash, but I reassured him. "Just a quick walk, buddy. We'll be fine." But as we moved further away from the familiar trails, I felt a chill seep into the air. It was quiet, too quiet. My breath hung in the air, visible and heavy. Suddenly, a rustle behind me made me turn sharply, heart racing. "Max?" I called softly, but he was already on high alert, ears perked and hackles raised. I scanned the darkness, straining to see. The shadows danced among the trees, and for a moment, I thought I caught a glimpse of movement. I shook my head, dismissing it as my imagination. Maybe I should head back. Just as I turned to leave, I heard it again, a soft, shuffling noise like something dragging across the ground. "Who's there?" I called, trying to sound braver than I felt. Silence fell again, but I could feel something watching me from the dark. I felt an icy grip around my heart as I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the direction of the noise. "Max, come on!" I whispered urgently. The dog whimpered, clearly sensing the tension in the air. Just then, the shadows shifted, and for a fleeting moment, I caught sight of a figure. It was tall and thin, just like the man from the camp, but it didn't quite resemble him. The figure stood there, watching me, its face hidden in the darkness. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. There was no answer, just the sound of heavy breathing. Was it mine, or was it coming from the figure? Panic surged, and I yanked on Max's leash, turning to flee. We dashed through the underbrush, branches snagging at my clothes as I raced back toward the park's entrance. I didn't stop until we reached the safety of the streetlights, my heart pounding like a war drum. I glanced back, but the woods were still and dark, hiding their secrets. That night, I locked the doors and pulled the curtains tight, trying to shake off the terror of what I'd seen. I'd learned too much about the dark corners of my world, how easily someone could disappear, and how even in life, we might not truly be alone. Days turned into weeks, and though I tried to shake the fear, it lingered in the back of my mind. I returned to my evening walks, but I avoided the woods, keeping to the more populated paths. Still, every time the wind rustled through the trees, I felt a chill race down my spine. And every night, I thought of that man in the tent. His eyes, vacant and lifeless, and the realization that someone had visited him after his death. The unsettling thought haunted me: who had been there, and what had they wanted? As time passed, I tried to forget the shadowy figure, but it became part of my routine to glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see it lurking behind the trees. I had learned that sometimes the past doesn't just fade away. It lingers, waiting to remind you of the darkness that can dwell within us all.